But isn't that the very thing that a lot of these far-right groups are saying? That although they've been demonstrating, they've been protesting, actually the politicians are still indulging, using their terminology, the minorities, and their grievances are not being aired. So it seems like a lose-lose, that the minority communities are feeling increasingly persecuted and the majority communities are feeling increasingly not listened to. And so we have these almost contradictory state of affairs.
I entirely agree. It is a lose-lose. That's very well put, Salma. I'm not sure what the politicians hoped to get by it. They are fanning the flames of a negative and prejudicial set of feelings, while at the same time they obviously realize, pragmatically, even if they don't see themselves as committed to multiculturalism in a kind of idealistic way, they see pragmatically that some of these policies have to be developed. They're certainly not reversing them. So it is a slightly schizophrenic attitude. I guess the one area where I would say that new policies have been developed. I mean, obviously there are areas around security and prevent and everything. New policies have been developed, but closer to multiculturalism, I think where some new policies have been developed which are in some ways quite different from early New Labour is, I suppose, around naturalization and citizenship, because the citizenship tests with some, knowledge questions about the country, with the demonstration, having to demonstrate proficiency in the English language and so on. This is a new set of policies that weren't being promoted in the 1990s. So you could say that this is something other than multiculturalism. My own view is actually that these policies, regardless of whether one agrees with all the details, that these policies are broadly right if they're taken together with a endorsement and development of multiculturalism, because they don't displace multiculturalism, but they balance it. Sure. Because, of course, our common citizenship is important, and we should extend that as a capacity to all citizens, including new citizens. Wow. What we mustn't do is to impose either by policy or through social pressure, the idea that in order for British citizens to fully exercise their rights, that they have to, in some sense, conform to a cultural model. They have to assimilate in order to be full citizens. That we mustn't do, and this report stands out against that.
Well, before I come back to Elizabeth, in terms of specific alternatives which you are outlining in that positive way, as somebody on the coalface, as it were, within the Muslim community, we're hearing both of these messages, that we need to do more to show our commonality, and at the same time there's increasing pressure to say, well, don't make yourselves out to be some kind of special grouping, when the reality is there are specific needs still.
I think the saddest thing about this whole debate on multiculturalism is that multiculturalism about all communities, all ethnic communities, and not just the Muslim community. But every time we hear an attack on the multiculturalism, it seems that almost as if it is designed, somehow multiculturalism made
definitely seen as the code for Muslims.
For
it's the
attacking the
Muslims.
Yes, it's attacking. I don't think they even would necessarily hide behind it. I mean, if you take Cameron's speech in Munich, for example, as a classic example, he talked about multiculturalism has failed, and then he moves on about the Muslim community and the war on terror and all these things. So,
and the Muslim community certainly understood that message
exactly. But what I don't really understand is that if we look at in this country, I mean, we heard Patrick earlier about his experiences in schools and getting beaten up. And this is not quite different from many other people's experiences in the 70s and to some extent even early 80s. And so the progress that we have achieved from a society where minorities felt really, not welcome and, threatened, to where we have a reasonable accommodation of different groups and communities is because of these policies.
Well, the difference, of course, now is at that time, Asians, blacks and white people got together to fight it in solidarity, and because it was seen as an attack on all minorities. And now it's almost easier for people
because
say,
they're
well, we're not racist, and this is what the EDL will say, we're not racist, we just got a problem with these Muslim extremists, except a lot of Muslims get lumped in that category. Other, it's harder for solidarity work, not that it's not happening. It's easier for some people to say, well, it's just the Muslim problem.
Yeah.
So other minorities almost want to distance themselves even more so that they're in the safe terrain.
That highlights two issues. One is that all of us who feel strongly about these issues, whether we necessarily agree about the Muslim community getting a better treatment or not, if we feel strongly about these values, the principles of multiculturalism, where we try to recognize the great things that many other communities does, we recognize the individuality and the specificity of certain communities, while at the same time emphasize that it is important as a nation to have some core values, common values that unite us. That is the focus, and if you value those principles, then it is important that regardless of whether multiculturalism is used to attack the Muslims or otherwise, it's important that everybody tries to defend those values, because it is what makes us a better nation. But another point I would also bring, though, is that we often get the impression that Britain was a very Anglo-Saxon white society, and somehow these minority groups coming here are taking away many of the benefits that they ought to have been enjoying. But what we forget is that the modern Britain is not just about the white indigenous, so-called indigenous population. It's also about contributions that many other people have made. Yesterday, we remembered the soldiers who have befallen, and we know many hundreds of thousands of soldiers from across the world, from different nationalities, different ethnicities, and especially Muslim communities, fought for this country to make it what it is today. And if we today turn back to them and say, look, we don't recognize the contributions of these multicultural societies, we don't recognize that they have specific needs which may be different from others, then that would be an injustice to these people who has made the ultimate sacrifice for this country.
Point well made there. Well, Elizabeth, coming on to the actual substance of your report, you mentioned how it's almost unfashionable to even defend multiculturalism, never mind to say we need to promote more of it. What would be your summary of what this alternative looks like to the negative discourse at the moment?
Of course. Well, the title of the report is Multiculturalism, a Christian Retrieval. And Jonathan Chaplin, who's the author of the report, has really said that what we need is to reform and reframe multiculturalism in a more modest, chastened form. That actually, one of the reasons it's been so easy to attack is that some of the rhetoric around multiculturalism was too ambitious, was too grandiose. It wanted us to suddenly all hold hands and be best friends and to celebrate each other and to be really fraternal with each other. And we believe that that can and does happen. We just don't think it's the state's job to make it happen. So we had Trevor Phillips warning us in 2005 about sleepwalking into segregation. Neither do we want the government frog marching us into fraternity. So it really is quite a stripped back concept of what multicultural justice might look like. Jonathan Chaplin uses
give some specific examples then. If it's broken down at a community level, what change or what are you advocating?
It would be really trying to ensure that each group in the UK is able to be authentically expressing their identities, that they are protected from discrimination and that they are protected from disadvantage. And that's as far as multicultural justice would go. Now that in each individual case will take a lot of hard thinking. We're still working through what the actual implications will be in really specific policies, and in general it will be on a case-by-case basis. This report is really an opening salvo to say we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There is a really important project here if we want to build a good and a just society. Let's get down to the hard work of looking at what it looks like, rather than trying to flee away and be nostalgic and sentimental and pretend that we're not actually as diverse as we really are.
Yeah, because again, we've got the concepts like the big society, so we get these SOPs
yes.
thrown out. So
yes.
It's as if people are saying, well, we're not really talking about simulation here.
Yeah.
But the key message does still seem to be that there are these troublesome communities which are spoiling it for everybody else, and that message is taken home onto the streets, where communities who are the minority feel under pressure, and communities of the majority feel this sense of greater grievance. How do you get that balance, in your opinion?
Well, one of the things we're calling for is more honesty in the debate, and we've touched on it already, that actually politicians need to resist the temptation to make a populist sideswipe at multiculturalism. And things are changing. We've seen Paul Goodman, who is a Tory MP, calling for his own party to stop denouncing multiculturalism. He says that even though they might not mean it like that, minorities feel like they themselves and their very presence in the UK is being denounced.
Yeah.
He really wants us to talk instead about tolerance. So we really hope that perhaps there might be a little bit less political point scoring and some more realistic, pragmatist commitment to the work of living in our diverse society.
Well, we've got very little time. If I can just give the final word to our phone guest, Professor Tariq Modood, in a very succinct way, what would be your policy recommendation to government, whoever happens to be in power, to get that balance right, to show they're listening to people who perhaps feel they haven't been listened to in terms of their grievances and concerns around immigration and multiculturalism, whilst not making people who are from a different background feel unwelcome?
Well, I think probably the single biggest recommendation, and this is something we've already touched on, is to use a more realistic rhetoric and a more respectful rhetoric to not stigmatize any group in society. And of course, Muslims have been badly stigmatized by this discourse and more explicit anti-Muslim discourses. And where policies need to be balanced, and I do, appreciate the need for instance, for emphasizing local cross-cultural encounters and cooperation and bonding, all the kinds of things that go under the label of community cohesion. But all that can be supplementary to multiculturalism. It's not a denial of multiculturalism as long as we base it on respect for each other and respect for cultural identities, religious identities that are important to people and should not be sacrificed, or people have to get rid of them for the sake of fitting in. So I think the rhetoric of respect for people's chosen identities within a shared common British citizenship, I think that's the single biggest recommendation I'd make.
Well, thank you very much, Tariq, and to all our guests here today who've come in, a positive alternative to the negative rhetoric around multiculturalism. Thank you so much for joining us. Do join us same time next week, and don't forget you can see us on YouTube as well as tweet us. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much.
Thank you.